I introduce the Ken Kennedy Distinguished Lecturer, I first want to take a few minutes to talk about Ken Kennedy, as he was very well known for his research in high-performance computing, especially in the area of compilers. I had the pleasure of getting to know Ken, and it was often through the supercomputing conferences, which is the major conference in high-performance computing. And Ken was a major advocate for diversity. He was one of our plenary speakers at the first Tapia conference in 2001 that was held in Houston, Texas. So we're happy that we're able to honor Ken in terms of having the Ken Kennedy Distinguished Lecturer. And now, to introduce our Ken Kennedy Distinguished Lecturer, it is my pleasure to introduce the accomplished roboticist, entrepreneur, and educator, Dean Ayanna Howard, who is the first woman to lead the College of Engineering at The Ohio State University. Her career spans higher education, NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, as well as the private sector. Dr. Howard is the founder and president of the board of directors for Robotics, which is a Georgia Tech spinoff company that develops mobile therapy and educational products for children with special needs. Robotics products are based on Dr. Howard's research. She is a fellow of IEEE, AAAI, AAAS, and the National Academy of Inventors. And let me elaborate a little bit. IEEE is the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. You have AAAI, which is also the organization with artificial intelligence, and AAAS, which actually is just around the corner, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She is the recipient also of the 2018 Richard A. Tapia Achievement Award for Scientific Scholarship, Civic Science, and Diversifying Computing. And she is the recipient of the ACM Athena Lecturer Award, for which she is giving her lecture here at the Tapia Conference. And I just want to say, Dr. Ayanna Howard has many additional awards, but we want to have time, too, for her excellent presentation. And then a side note, and that is, what was it? Probably a few months ago, I had the opportunity to go through the Museum of Science and Industry. And so Dr. Ayanna Howard is featured in the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago for the future of technology. So I was so excited, I had to take a picture and send it, but it was really excited, and I could tell everyone, I know her on that picture in the museum. How exciting. So it's a wonderful pleasure to introduce and to ask to come to the stage Dr. Ayanna Howard.
All right, so what I want to do with this time that I have with you is talk to you about this element of ethics, bias, AI, and robotics. And so I'm a storyteller, so I tend to use stories as well as research and images, and yes, there will be videos of robots and people in my presentation. So to set the stage, to really understand my framing when I talk about bias and what this means, give you a little bit of a story. So I have a number of labels. We all have labels, especially if you're from you have a physical representation, you come into a room, computer scientist, engineer, you will always have a label. So some of my labels, the ones that I claim, are things like US top women in tech, or 23 of the most powerful women engineers in the world. And I claim these because people are going to label you all the time. That is their bias. You come in, that is the bias that the world imposes, and it is your choice to choose which label that you choose and actually embody. Now, I have one label in the middle, which is the nation's most senior African-American female roboticist in higher ed. And I remember when the article came out, I did not want that label at first because I thought it basically says that I'm old, and I didn't feel that old. But then I thought about this, and I thought about the platform. I thought about the messaging that I always have around how you have to have individuals that have a diverse perspective on a team when you think about innovation. And I decided that I was going to claim that label, not because I thought I was old, and if you think I am, please do not tell me that. But I thought about it because it allows me to have a platform to come and talk to individuals and say, this is the label that the world has given me. Clearly, if I'm the oldest, we have a problem in our world and we have a problem in our society. So it allows me to have a platform to say, we can do better. And so that is the part of the labels. But why I introduce this talk with the understanding of labels is that these are the biases that the world imposes. And it's creeping into our systems. It's creeping into our computing architectures, our society. And I want to talk a little bit about what that means and even ways that we might think of it in terms of our role and our responsibility in mitigating that. So I started, and where this came about, my very first position, my very first job, I was at NASA's JPL, and I was tasked with thinking about future Mars rover exploration missions. And I remember at the time, I just finished my PhD. I'd been working at NASA a couple of summers, and my supervisor says, I want you to lead this team. And I was, just so you know, I was 27. I was like, clearly, you don't know who I am. And he was like, no, I want you to lead this team. And so, I was put in front of a number of engineers and computer scientists. All, of course, did not look like me, all from different backgrounds. I was the only female, of course, at the time. And I remember moving the team and realizing that I couldn't just use engineers and computer scientists. I had to bring in scientists. I had to bring in climatologists, astrobiologists into the team to think about artificial intelligence and rovers of the future. And it was highly successful. And I remember at the end, I came back to my supervisor. It's like, well, why me in the first place, right? Like, I didn't lead a team before. I had no idea what I was doing. I was kind of stumbling and trying to figure it out. And he said, when I saw you coming into teams before, you would come in and you would sit there and we would talk about things and we would have this idea and everyone was like, yeah, that's a great idea. And you would come and say, I know this is different, but what about X? And he says, I saw you continue to do that over and over and over again. We were all like set on this idea over here, and you would say something that was kind of off sometimes, but it shifted the conversation. And because of that, we always ended up with a better idea, a better solution. Sometimes it was a combination. Sometimes it was like, well, that's actually great, and we'll go that way. Or sometimes like, well, those elements were going to feed into this idea. And I realized when people talk about diversity and when people talk about inclusive teams, really the whole concept is that when you have individuals that have a different perspective, when you give them the space to speak up and accept their words and accept their experience, you actually have better innovation. You have better science, you have better technology. And so I realize when people talk about diversity, it's very easy to say, well, because you're a black woman, of course you're a diverse person. But it's not about that. It really is allowing the space for me to bring in my perspective and my language and my experience because I am a black woman in a technical area that has grown up in an environment where I don't see a lot of people like myself. It gives me a different perspective. And by having that power and being confident in speaking up, it allows us to create robotics and AI systems that are powerful, impactful. And so the outcome is that innovation happens. What that has done, though, is it's fed this idea of when you have diverse perspective, when you do not allow that perspective to come into a technology, you have this semblance and you have this increase of bias. And that's what I want to talk about today. So I don't know, how many of you know about the Turing test in terms of artificial intelligence? Okay, so a number of you. So for those of you who do not, the Turing test is one of these tests that when we think about artificial intelligence and machine learning and how do you know if a machine is as intelligent as you think? The test was you would have as we were taught in school, is you would have a machine and a person behind a curtain. You would have an observer who was questioning between asking questions, and if the person couldn't figure out which was the machine and which was the person, then the machine was intelligent. So the framing of intelligence was really from the point of the observer. And you can say, well, what if you have a stupid person asking questions, right? Like that was really never the question. It was basically a commentary that the machine is intelligent if the person that's interacting with the machine thinks it's intelligent with reference to a person, with reference to a human. Now, what a lot of people do not know is that the actual experiment is based on a bias concept. So the actual experiment, just so you know, is that there is a woman behind the curtain and there is a man behind the curtain. The observer actually questions, and if the man can pretend that they are a woman, intelligent, then they replace the man with a machine. And if the machine can outwit the observer and do it more times than the man, then the machine must be intelligent. And so think about that. It means that our fundamental concept of artificial intelligence and whether a machine is intelligent is already based on a biased concept. Can society, can a machine actually fool us to think that the machine can act and answer questions like a woman? So if you think about the fundamental concept of even AI, and when we think about data and we think about extracting information, we are extracting it from the observer point of view, which is going to naturally be biased. It's just inherent in us. In some cases, it makes humanity, glorious and interesting, but in other cases, when we put it into our AI systems, it also makes it sometimes inaccurate. Sometimes it augments the inequities that we have in our society, because who is that observer? It could be the stupid person. And so when I think about AI and I think about intelligence, it's really not about looking at how intelligent is a machine when you compare it to the human being. It really is how biased is the machine. Because at the end of the day, we are learning from people. We are learning from individuals that are interacting in our society. We're learning from data that's extracted from internet, from our smartwatches. We are learning data from people, and the fact is we are biased. And depending on the group that you're in, we are more biased in some cases than others. And this is the data that's feeding into our robotic and AI systems. And so when we, as an observer, look at these machines, it's not just about intelligence, it's about this element of biased intelligence, which is creeping into our systems. And so as computer scientists, we do have a role to think about this systematically, strategically, because we are also creating these biased systems. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about these elements of bias and what happens when you have these biases feed into our systems. So one of the things I want to talk about is cognitive bias. When people talk about bias, a lot of times in the news, sometimes it's always negative, like, oh, there's this racist algorithm that is doing this, or there's a sexist algorithm that's doing that. But the fact is that bias is our human nature. In some instances, it allows us to filter data. It allows us to perceive. It allows us to take this entire room, and my element of bias is I group it in terms of, okay, I see people, whereas I may not see individuals unless I see Valerie right there because I recognize her. But that's the elements of bias. It's the way that our brain tries to filter through all the information that's out there. And so we as people have a cognitive bias, especially with respect to machines, which is actually quite interesting. So part of my research is I design, develop algorithms and robotic systems that address the needs of children with diverse abilities. Primarily, I look at children with motor disabilities, children with cerebral palsy, some children with autism spectrum disorder, with mobility impairments. And so my whole point is, how do I design robotic systems? How do I design algorithms that can engage children in exercise? And so statistics, these are the last statistics, about a year old. There are estimated, and I'll say estimated for a reason, 240 million children with disabilities worldwide. And why I say it's estimated is that these are pretty much self-reporting. So they have these surveys in the US census data, and this information is extracted. So in places that do pretty good at collecting data, these numbers are fairly accurate. But for other places where disabilities is not necessarily understood, or in some cases we still have countries that if you have a child with a certain disability, you don't go out, is underreported. And so truly believe that the number, and those of us who work in this space in terms of children with disabilities, truly believe that this is probably an undercount, but we'll go with the 240 million. Now, as an adult, the last statistic was that 1 in 4 US adults live with a disability. So what does that mean? Think about that. That means in this room, most of the tables I see have maybe 3. If I take 2 tables, that means that of the 2, there is some element of an aspect. It could be a hearing impairment, it could be mild mobility impairment, it could be a cognitive impairment. It's basically something is going on, and as you age, something will, it takes me a long time to walk across the street. Every so often, I feel that arthritis kicking in. At some point, I know that it's going to be difficult for me to type, right? And thinking about that, and this is before we had COVID. So as we know, COVID has introduced a number of things. And so the 1 in 4 is probably going to increase in terms of 1 in 3 maybe. We don't know. But basically why I put this stat up is that for all of you students that are working in computer science, that are working in algorithms, now is the time to think about what does it mean when we talk about accessibility? What does it mean when we talk about inclusiveness? What does it mean when we talk about designing technology that works for everyone? Because the fact is, you will be the users of that technology. And while you're here and you're thinking and you're creative and you're innovative, now it's the time to make solutions for the future. And this is the future for you. And so I always put that stats not to kind of scare you, but to motivate you that this is an everyone kind of solution where we all contribute to this. So in my world, I look at this element of human-human interaction. And the reason why is that I have children, I want to bring in robotic technology, I want them to interact with each other, and so I need my robots to mimic the interactions that children already understand. So a child is interacting with a clinician in the clinical setting. I want to come in and have the robot imitate the clinician in the exact same way so that when they're in the home, it's familiar. So it's just continuously going through the exercise, going through the actions. It's continuous practice, practice, practice. And in order to do that, we take a lot of data. We go into the clinics, we retrofit, we put cameras, we put wearables, we extract all this data because we want to imitate what happens. When the child is doing this, what is the clinician human doing? When the clinician is doing this, what is the child doing? How does the clinician interrupt if they want to direct the child to a certain action or a certain behavior? And so we take all this information and we then code it and put it on the robotic system so it becomes an expert system.
Easy, hard, or medium?
Hard.
Here we go. You can do better.
Okay. Your turn, robot.
My turn. I'm not good at this.
But you can beat me.
Go ahead.
Okay, but robot, I'm not really good at this game.
You are amazing.
Thank you, robot.
You ready to go to bed?
So one of the things, and if you notice at the very top, I say mimicking and influencing human behavior. But what we're doing, we're mimicking and influencing. That's the computer science way of looking at it. But at the end of the day, what we're also doing is we are manipulating human behavior. What does a human clinician do when they're interacting with a child? They have an objective function. They want the child to do certain actions. You then lead the child to that action. Sometimes it's nudging the behavior. Sometimes it's saying, well, why don't you do this? But at the end of the day, the child wants to do this. You want them to do something else. And so you use, sometimes it's like, that's a great job. Why don't you do that again? What are you doing? You're giving them positive reinforcement. All right, let me show you a better way of doing that. What are you doing? You're redirecting them. So we as people do it all the time. Professors do it all the time. So when we're designing robots and we're designing AI systems to influencing human behavior, one of the things we do have to claim is that we are not just mimicking and influencing, we are manipulating. And yet when we talk about human-human interaction, we don't use the form and we don't use the phrase manipulation. But as soon as you cast it into a metal body, as soon as you call it autonomous, as soon as you put it on the web, now becomes this word manipulation. And it's some element of because we no longer have autonomy in terms of deciding yes or no. And why is that? One is because when machines do it, it must be more intelligent. As an observer, the machine is acting just like the human. In this case, the clinician, and in most cases, the clinician, at least with children, is female. That is what we're doing. But the outcomes, no one will say that they're bad outcomes. And so this is, I always show one of our first full studies, which showed that when we bring in these systems, when we bring in these robotic systems, when we look at the outcomes, and so the first line is when you have no robot that's there. In this case, we wanted the child to move faster. We also we want increased range of motion, different elements in terms of kinematic features. When the robot is there, clearly the robot is having an impact. The child is happy, engaging, doing the exercise, moving as the clinician has desired the robot to command and manipulate and mimic and influence. And then when the robot is extracted and we look at what is going on, we see an improvement in the measured. So if we wanted the child to move faster, we remove the robot, the child continues to move faster at that speed, not as fast as when the robot was there nudging, but definitely has an improvement in all the parameters that the clinician and in some cases the parents care about. And so no one will question when I bring in a robot for a good thing, for good impact, no one says, well, you're manipulating my child and this is bad. I don't want my child to actually be manipulated. It's wow, this is great. What else can we do? How many more sessions can we have? It's always in this positive aspect, even though at the end of the day, we are taking information, we are modeling human behavior, we understand how a child will react based on certain things, and all we're doing is we say, well, in this state, we know the child needs this kind of input, and so we are going to influence, mimic, manipulate, so that we get the correct outcome that is desirable. No one actually questions that because at the end, you see improvement. And even when we then ask about what is your state of mind? How do you feel? What we get, which is quite interesting, is that children will say, I enjoy this more than when I'm working with my human clinician. I feel more self-empowered when I'm working with my robot than my human clinician. I feel like I have choice and I feel more competent when I'm working with the robot than when I'm working with my human clinician, even though the protocol is the same. They're working with the clinician, it's the same protocol as when they're working in the home, but with the robot, there's still this sense of more autonomy, more competence. And yet, if you think about it, it's the same kind of algorithms, but it's wrapped in a metal body. And then when we ask about elements of, well, was there trust involved when you're working with the human versus with the robot, it's well, with the human, I just did it because I had to. But with the robot, I trust the robot. I trust that is giving me the information that is in my best interest. I trust that the robot knows what it's doing. The clinician, it's their job. And so if you think about this, one of the issues and why this is a problem is that this is the same phenomena that we see when we have AI that's being used by the general public, that's being used in terms of chatbots and language models and search engines and recommender systems, is because when people are using these systems, these AI systems, these robotic systems, it's well, the system must know what it's doing. Whereas if you call a person and they're a customer service human, how many times do you question, are you sure? Maybe I need to talk to your supervisor. We don't do that when an AI tells us the same thing. And so when humans interact with our systems, they go into this cognitive bias, i.e. the machine knows better. So what does that mean? Now comes the exciting part. Humans trust machines. Humans follow the directions of machines, whether the machine is right or wrong, and we already know the machine is biased. And so what does this mean when we look at AI and we look at this influence and we look at this manipulation? What is it that comes out of that? So I'm going to show you a few studies and then show you then when bias is introduced, what happens. So we did a study a couple of years ago, about 3 years ago, where we wanted to look at, well, what happens if you bring in a machine, you bring in a robotic system, and The robot is giving you information. So we did basically a rendition of Simon Says. And if you remember, it's here are the color sequence, yellow, blue, red, red, red. You then have to repeat. And we influenced the system such that there was no way, unless you were an expert player, that you would remember the sequence. So we did it just long enough where you would basically get it wrong. And then the robot would give you some information, give you advice, give you like, oh, here's a sequence, let me help you. And we looked at different ways that the robot could do this. We looked at ways where the user would...
3, 2, 1.
So here, my robot is just
The sequence is green.
interrupting.
Blue.
We also looked at what happens if, as the user is going through the sequence, the user asks for help. So one is the user's pressing and the robot's like, oh, let me tell you the sequence just because I want to butt in. Other is like, I'm lost, giving the autonomy. Then the other two was when the user makes a mistake, the robot basically says, oh, wait, you just made a mistake, versus the user goes through the entire sequence and then the robot's like, you know that first yellow? Yeah, that was the one that was wrong, even though you just went through 7 sequences. So we did that. And then we introduced the fact of what happens if the robot then gives the wrong answer. So here's a decision, here's the information, you're right, great, I get my points, I get my $5. Well, what happens now if the robot gives you the incorrect information? Well, we wanted to see, would people actually release that cognitive bias? Would they have less trust in the robot? Would they stop using the robot and say, okay, I don't trust you anymore. I have this cognitive bias, but clearly you don't know what you're doing. You must not be as intelligent as I thought. What would happen to the human's interaction with this AI system? And what we found was quite interesting. In the post-corrective case, what we found is irrespective of if the robot was correct or incorrect. And so here's before mistakes, i.e. the robot gives the correct information. And after mistakes, this is the robot basically gives incorrect information. What we found is if the robot gives information after you do the entire sequence, even if it's correct, you actually are pretty much disengaged. Basically, it's if you are wasting my time, I can waste my own time by myself. I don't need you wasting my time as well. So I don't really care if you're right or wrong. You're still wasting my time. Let me just take my mistakes and just go out the door. I don't need you. What's interesting is that the best case was unsolicited, i.e. whether the robot was right or wrong, if we gave individuals the ability to ask for help, if the robot was right, great. If the robot was wrong, I asked. So I take it on myself because I asked, which is actually quite interesting. It basically means that as long as individuals have the feeling of autonomy, just like with my healthcare robotic systems, the child could choose to follow the direction or not. As long as we simulate that kind of interaction, people will continue using the robot. Oh, my GPS just took me 2 hours out of my way. Well, I followed the GPS, so it's my fault. I will continue using it again. Maybe I'll be like, well, last time it was 2 hours. Okay, that's fine. I can deal with it, right? This is what we do as long as we feel that we have autonomy. Now, how do you give individuals autonomy? It's actually pretty straightforward. How are you doing? Great. Oh, well, can I help you? Sure. I can tell you anything, and if I'm wrong, if I tell you there's a great restaurant and the food sucks, you are not going to blame me. You're actually going to blame yourself because you took it on and you made that decision, even if I intentionally give you the worst restaurant that is outside of this hotel. This is how we interact, and this is how we think about machines.
Are you sure this is right? I think the sequence is yellow, blue, green, 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 white, blue, white.
And I did blue, white, blue. Yeah. That's wrong. Get ready. You like.
So interesting enough, when we do have these mismatches, we have a very visceral, in certain cases, response, a very emotional response. When we do these studies where we have a human, because everything we have to compare, what's the baseline? The baseline is human-human, we bring in the machines. We don't get that kind of response when you have an individual interacting with another human. You don't get this emotional response as if you lied. But yet when we have a machine, there's this bias that the machine is correct, the machine is right, and how dare it tell me a misinformation? Like that just totally changes my entire belief system. And therefore, that's really, really unfair. We see these emotional responses that is actually surprising.
You can't say anything like it right because you hate me.
And so we see this over and over and over again. And so what we wanted to see was, given that we have this response, this emotional response for a machine that's wrapped in metal that we don't have when we're interacting with another person, can we push that? I mean, what is acceptable? So if we think about lying, if we think about manipulation, is there boundary conditions of when we should and when we shouldn't? And so we wanted to test this out. We wanted to see, is there boundary conditions? When individuals are interacting, maybe there's some perception. Maybe what we need to figure out is, these are the situations where we have an emotional response, and these are where we don't really care. And so we did another study where we wanted to see, what does it look like when you have a robot that actually lies, and when is it acceptable behavior?
Hi, my name is Pepper and I am a humanoid robot. I am able to perform a variety of different occupations. I can also assist people with lots of daily tasks. I also have the ability to tell lies when I believe it is in your best interest to do so. For example, if you ask me if you look good in a certain outfit, I may choose to say yes, even if I do not think you look good.
So we wanted to see what happens if the robot lies. And again, humans do this all the time. So all we're doing is mimicking human behavior, human biases. We are not inventing something. We are not saying, well, this is different and this is a task only for a robot. This is basically, we're just modeling human-human interaction. And again, when is it acceptable? So we looked at it, we had different scenarios, and we looked at an education scenario because we thought this would be acceptable if we had something where we are educating or we're teaching and we're doing something for good. So this is optimal. And so we had 3 target groups, and we had some, but the interesting parts of it is we looked at what happens when you have a robot and a child, human and child comparison. We have the traditional adult, and then we have older adults. And we look to see, when you have a robot versus a human, is it appropriate and does it make sense? Because we just kind of want to extract it. And so interesting, and I'll decompose what this says, is that when you have a robot interacting with an adult, it is appropriate. It's appropriate. It makes sense. I want my robot tutor. It's appropriate. And this is with respect to lying. Now, when you have a child and a robot, nope, it is not appropriate for a robot to lie to a child. It is somewhat appropriate, but not as appropriate for a robot to lie to an older adult. That's a fact, i.e., I'm an adult. I'm actually, so just so you know, the adult range is between 18 and 65. So that's our adult range. So just so you know, anyone out there, you can figure out, are you an adult, or are you in the child range, or are you in the older adult range? So it says that if a robot is interacting with an adult, it is totally appropriate for a robot to lie. It is not appropriate for another person to lie to me. We do not want another person that is a human person to lie to me, even if it's in, quote unquote, our best interests. But if it's for a child, okay, we want to lie. Lying is fine when it's a child. Of course, they don't know any better. Lie all you want. That is definitely appropriate. But then if we ask, does it make sense? So you don't want a robot to lie to a child. You think it's appropriate if a human lies, but does it make sense? And in the case of children, it makes total sense. I don't like robots lying to kids. I don't really want it. But you know what? It makes sense. It makes sense. And so what we found, deeper dive, is that when individuals are interacting with a robot, if it makes sense, even if you don't think it's appropriate, you will have a visceral response. You'll have an emotional response. But at the end, you're like, well, robot tutor, I mean, it makes sense. Robot healthcare consultant, it makes sense. Robot guy, it makes sense. I don't want it to lie, but it makes sense for the application. But when it does, it pisses me off. So that is the emotional response, which is quite interesting. It also still means that we will continue using these robotic systems, irrespective of whether they're biased or manipulating. And so what's the problem? I'm going to talk about what the time I have is the problem, is that, as I mentioned, with the Turing test, is that the data, the learning, the expert systems, the mimicking, the influencing is all based on human-human interaction data. It's based on real data. It's based on how we interact with each other. And that's a problem if we are learning from a biased world, and 100% guarantee we are learning from a biased world. And so what does this look like when you have this? So I'll talk a little bit about bias. And a lot of times I think when we see this word bias, I know it used to be my shoulders would get tight. I come into a room, I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna have to deal with some drama. But in actuality, the way that bias works, it's kind of wired in our brain circuitry. But for reasonable people, when we are made aware of it, we tend to try to fix it. We tend to be like, okay, I know that I'm biased with respect to this. I know that now. And so when I'm in a room and I'm interacting, I'm going to be more conscious. So most reasonable people, they might be biased when they are called on it. They try to do right. Not that they always do right, so let's get that straight. But reasonable people try once they're made aware. And I always like to use the example of, because I work with kids, I always like to use the example of age. So we all know that for things like eyewitness testimonies, we know that there is a bias with respect to race, but also age. Traditionally, if you look at trials, you have an eyewitness. If you have an older adult and they have to do an eyewitness against someone who's a teenager, they can't tell the difference, just so you know, right? And it's just like children under a certain age, everyone looks like grandma, right? Everyone looks like grandma. But yet in their classroom, they know Samantha, they know Tamika, they know Joe, down to they even know between the two twins. Right? And you're like, oh my gosh, like all the kids look the same. So it's the way that the brain structures data and information. So I'm interacting day to day. I see myself in the mirror, and so I'm going to know who's in my class. They're in my same age. And so I'm going to take that data because I have to figure out how to filter that. I have to have higher resolution. I have to be able to figure out who is who, and so my brain remaps. I only see grandma maybe once a month, right? And so we're gonna put her over here, and therefore very coarse resolution, so everyone who sort of looks like grandma is grandma until you get to a certain age, and your brain starts coalescing and having more resolution across things that you then become important. And so if you are growing up in a society where you do not see anyone who looks different, your brain is restructuring because you have to figure out the individuals and this aspect. And if all you see is TV individuals that are outside, your brain's going to structure of, here's this group, and I'm going to identify them as this because I only see them once a night at 6 p.m. So this is the way we structure it. And why is this a problem? Well, as we know, we have these things called facial recognition, emotion recognition, although some companies are starting to pull back in terms of allowing the APIs out there. But I will tell you, for every company that is pulling back in terms of general release, government is still using it, organizations are still using it, and so it's still creeping into our systems. And therefore, if you think about this fact that we have an age bias, we have a gender bias, we have a race bias, if we think about these systems that are deployed, they are deployed based on data from a biased data set. They are deployed based on an observer. And if the observer is not of all genders, not of all ages, not of all races, the information about what's intelligent and what's not is going to be based on that one viewpoint of the observer, even if the observer is in if they have the same viewpoint, that is how the data is going to be labeled. And so when we look at emotion recognition, we do know that these systems are deployed, they continue to be deployed, facial recognition continues to be integrated in our world, in our society, and we know that the outcomes can be different. There's been a number of papers on a lot of the race aspect, the gender aspect. Of course, I'm always concerned about age, because that is who I work with, those are the individuals I work with. And one of the things that we have looked at is, when we look at this age spectrum, is there an equivalent bias that we have? And just so you know, in our systems, these emotion recognition systems, there is a bias, i.e. when I say a bias, that means that the rate of accuracy, the false positives, the false negatives, and all the parameters that you can measure are different when you're looking at young children as well as older adults. And you think about this as like, well, why is that the case? Why is that? Well, first off, if you think about children, most people don't have like children photos of like crying children and angry children and children who are having fits. And as a 5-year-old, I'm not uploading my picture to TikTok, right? So this is not a thing. So it's going to be parents, it's going to be caregivers that are uploading it. And I don't want the world saying that my child is a screaming toddler because they didn't get ice cream. No, I'm going to do the happy birthday pictures where they're smiling and laughing and dancing. And therefore, if you think about even the data for children, you just don't even have the data. And yet these systems are then deployed as if they are accurate for everyone. And for older adults, which, you know, eventually, if God wills, we will all be older adults, it also doesn't work as well. And if you think about this, well, what's the problem? So one of the earlier papers that had come out that talked about this, the systems did change, they did alter. So we did an assessment, our first one was in 2019, we did 2020, we did a 2021. And what we saw was that if you looked across gender and you looked across race, the systems did improve. So companies did listen, companies did try to comply, try to collect more data, try to do a little bit of training. But the fact is, because age was not a concern, disability was not yelled out, they did not fix it for those target demographics that didn't have the largest voice. And so that's actually a problem. It should be not up to the companies to decide, okay, who do we have to satisfy? Who's yelling the loudest? Okay, we're gonna fix it for that group. Okay, who's the next loudest person? Okay, we're gonna fix it for that. It really is, I think, not just their responsibility, but for us as developers to also think intelligently, systematically about this from day zero, looking at our team and saying, okay, who is missing from this table? Well, I'm not missing because I'm here, but who is missing from this table? And I think one of the things we don't do as computer scientists is that a lot of times we do not talk up. We do not think about, we like, oh, cool, I get to work for X company. Oh, awesome, I get a code, I get to interact. We very rarely say, hey, my team doesn't look like me. I'm the only one. And are you respecting my voice? And if you're not, you know, I have 5 friends that also need jobs that came from my cohort that have different experiences, but we all kind of have a perspective that is unique to this team. We very rarely take a stand on that. And I think that it is one of our responsibilities because the fact is, I'm not going to, unless I'm intentionally forced to, or I'm aware of it, I'm not necessarily going to say who's missing from this table unless I'm very conscious about it and speak up. Again, I feel like most people are reasonable. If it's mentioned, people will say, oh, I know who's missing from this table. Oh, I do know who's missing from this table. We haven't thought about this group. We haven't thought about this group. But someone has to actually say it for people to actually have that conversation. And it can be fixed. And so for all of my group, all of my research, we identify the problems, we identify the bias, but then as a computer scientist, what's lovely about it is that we know how to fix it. Like we can actually go, well, you can't say that the problem is not fixable. You can't say, well, people are using it, they don't care. No. There's ways to fix it. And there's ways to fix it that are like straightforward, not even like we have to have a 5-year thesis in order to fix it. And so for everything, we also fix it. And so with emotions, thinking about how do you create learning systems that can feed but also be tacked on top of it is one way. And what does this mean? This means that as you're thinking about your algorithms, if you're into AI, always be aware of there is a solution. There's always a solution. I mean, that's why we go to school, is we can figure out, we're pretty smart, try to figure that out. So we've looked at this. I'm going to talk a little bit about language bias. So we've applied it to emotion recognition. As you know, language chatbots, there is as well bias. One of the things we've looked at is the bias in some of the basically hate speech algorithms. One of the things is when we had the murder of George Floyd, Twitter and Facebook and TikTok became a forum to gather, to express, to figure things out. And one of the results is that groups and tweets and posts were being taken down. And one of the things that was seen was that the groups that were taken down at the highest level were traditionally the groups that were impacted. And so we did a study to see, well, one is how bad is this? And then two, is there a way to think about these algorithms in order to fix it? And so we used AAE, we looked at Twitter data, and sure enough, all the algorithms that were out there that talked about they were equitable in terms of hate speech were definitely biased against African American, in this case, Black Twitter. I mean, in some cases, statistically different. So it's like, oh, so all those individuals that were tweeting that their posts were being taken down for no reason were probably correct. And so then thinking about this and saying, okay, what is it that we can do in order to augment this, given that these systems are out there, given that these algorithms are already deployed, again, using pretty much the same approach as emotion recognition is, take what's out there, you then create a wrapper around the impacted group, and therefore you don't change the recognition, you don't change the false positive, false negative for the group that it works for, but you also augment it so it works for everyone, at least the group that is being impacted. And so in the same way that you can do it for emotion recognition, you can do it for speech, you can do it for every parameter that is distinct and unique about us. You can do it in terms of language, you can do it around domestic English versus, rural Ohio or rural Georgia. We can think about this more creatively. Now, it doesn't mean that we will get it all right at the beginning, because again, my frame of reference is one thing. If I have another person, their frame of reference is another. And together we can say, oh, this is the group that's missing, but we are guaranteed going to miss another group because not everyone is at the table. And so it really is our role and our duty that when we identify another group, we say, oh, right, it's not a, well, we'll fix that later. It's a, what can I do to fix it now? Because as soon as we do that, we're going to find another group, and we're going to find another group. And at some point, we'll have it so that it's equitable for everyone. But until we are actively, continuously adapting and revising and not saying, well, we can do it for like beta version 9. It's like, no, let's try to fix it now. Systems, companies, they release things all the time, sometimes 2 months, 6 months, 9 months. Let's think about this element of bias as we're fixing the systems because some company calls and says, this is not working for me. Let's be basically good stewards of our development process and enable that. So I'm going to talk about one last thing and then open up for Q&A because I think I have about 10 minutes to do that. So the last thing, and this is a commentary, so we talked about language. Most language right now is in chatbots, so your Siri and your Alexa and whatever your chatbot flavor of the day is. And if you notice, most chatbots, at least in the US, have a woman voice. They have a female voice. And I think about this whole thing about Turing, and what was the lesson? It was, can the machine imitate a woman? And so when I listen to chatbots and I think about this concept of the machine imitating the woman, we are going back to the old age of Turing and the biases, and we're using these chatbots, and we then say, well, people react better to a female voice. People react better to having a voice that has a female intonation and intonation. And the fact is, just so you know, that's actually a falsity. If you actually go back to the studies of people who have done that, it has never been conclusive evidence that a female voice in an automated system actually has better outcomes for human-human interaction, period. And I can, if you want to know the studies, I can forward you all of those. So what we wanted to do was look at, well, if we have these gender biases that are prevalent, if you think about Turing, maybe we need to think about this cognitive bias. Maybe the fact is that when we're interacting with these systems, if there is a bias with respect to the role and the gender, maybe that's it. So we expect assistants, traditionally, at least in the United States, to be female. So maybe it's that bias, not the bias of the robot or the AI having. Maybe it's that bias. It's like, I expect an assistant to be female. I expect someone who, again, police as an example, I expect to be male. So maybe there's some element of this, and therefore if we cast the AI in that role, we're really trying to match it to that expectation, not necessarily the expectation of what gender the AI should have. And so we did this test. We had 3 renditions of a robot. We had and again, this was just the bimodal of male, female. So we had the male robot with a name and a voice. We had the female robot with a name and a voice. And we had a neutral robot, which had no name. And the voice, we had to actually go through a number of studies to try to get a neutral voice. We then did a pilot to make sure that if we said it was male, female, female, neutral, neutral. So that was all done in a pilot. And then we then tested it to then match the roles. Interesting, first off, is when we were asking about the gender, because when we're doing the full study, we had done the pre-study, so we knew we had it right, but in the real study, we wanted to make sure we didn't introduce any variables. We would ask the gender of the role, and then we would then match it. And some of this was also, we wanted to prime them. So if we asked them the gender, and they said male, we knew that that was also a priming for the function. And so that was also intentional, to just because we wanted them to be like, male robot. No, they shouldn't be a nurse robot, right? We wanted to prime that. Interesting enough, when we had the male, definitely male, female, female, when we did neutral, most individuals tagged the robot as male, which was baffling because in our prior studies, when we didn't talk about, this was a robot study around tasks, we were just saying, please evaluate the gender of this robot. It was fine. Neutral was neutral. In this case, as soon as we talked about tasks, most individuals, most participants labeled the robot as male. So all of a sudden it's like, oh, interesting. When individuals are interacting with AI and machines, there is a default assumption that the machine, if it has a gender, is male. Well, of course, this was baffling to us, which also meant that our hypothesis was going to not actually come to fruition. We actually thought there was going to be a cognitive mismatch. But this was interesting, which started us thinking of, then why do chatbots come out with a default voice of female? If we naturally have an inclination of thinking about AI and machines as having a male embodiment, if we have to force a gender, why is it that we continue having these female voices? Except that our developer sequence, assistance, that's the human bias, but not necessarily the AI bias. And so then we look at, well, what does this mean with the actual task? If I have a male gendered robot and I say it is a nurse robot, are you going to say, well, most males aren't nurses. In fact, if you look at the labor statistics, nurses typically is a gendered occupation of female. If you look at trash collector, it is a gendered occupation of male. And so we were like, okay, what happens if there is a gender mismatch or gender match because most people think of a male? And whether you have a male gendered robot in a male gendered role or a male gendered robot in a female gendered role and vice versa, the fact is there's no difference. Individuals that are using AI, that are using robots for different tasks, across the board, they believe the robot can do the task. Which says that when we are gendering as computer scientists these systems, we are gendering it based on our own developer bias. We are gendering it because we think that it's the right thing to do because, an assistant should be female because of US labor statistics. But the fact is that when we have a human interacting with a robot, the primary function, the primary bias is that it is a machine, it is a robot, it's an AI system, it knows better, it's smart, it's intelligent, and it has a gender? Oh, yeah, I guess it has a gender. And therefore, I think some of the lessons that I hope you get is that we as developers also need to stop contributing to the biases that we think about, that we believe. And so thinking about this element of a team speaking up when you have a diverse opinion, think about this element of how do we ensure that we don't introduce our own biases into our systems because we think it is best for the society and for interaction, I think is one of the things that we can do. Last thing, we can then use AI. So this is just the last example. I'm going to quickly go through it. We try to use this concept of using AI and the biases, our own biases, using it against us. And what we found was that we can, I'll just go to the last slide, we can actually use AI for helping us, teaching us to be less biased. Now, at the beginning I said most of us are reasonable. If we are made aware of our biases, we become more cognitive of it when we then interact. We've actually been able to show that when AI interrupts our biased process and says, you're biased, this is how you rethink this, we can actually train individuals to rethink. And so we did this with an emotion recognition task where we had individuals who clearly could not figure out how to label kids' images or label groups that were out-group. And we used AI to basically say, hey, I think you might want to consider this. And we were able to then show that we could retrain them doing the coding. So again, reasonable people, if we just shortchange and interrupt and let people aware of their bias, I think that we can also have better AI systems. I think there's hope. I think we can not only use AI, but our elements of having a diverse voice in a setting and speaking up to really focus on people, society, and this element of diversity. And so with that, I will close out and open up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Howard, for that very interesting talk. You made me think about how much I started to trust but verify those suggested moves that Candy Crush asked me to do when I'm trying to figure out what next move to make. So that was very interesting. Let's give her another round of applause. And we do, if you could stay at the stage while we entertain some of the questions. And so we do have a few right now. One question is, how can we engage with AI responsibly, knowing about their potential biases? What are some tools and strategies you use to be mindful of their influence?
So one of the things is when they say just say no, remember the old commercial? In some instances it's just say no. I intentionally, if I'm using Siri and Alexa, just so you know, you can change the voice. I intentionally will go into my settings and every so often will change. And I will tell you, it will feel uncomfortable, right? Because you are now, if you're using one of the voices and you've been using it for a while, to actually switch it to a different voice will actually feel uncomfortable. And there's reasons why, and I can go into that. But do it, because what happens then, it allows you to retrain yourself to not be in this biased role. It allows you to retrain yourself to not then have this entire reliance on this intonation, this structure of your agent. So there's a bunch of tricks. Search engines, don't touch the first two, right? Intentionally scroll to the second page. You're like, well, this is gonna increase my time. Do it. What happens is it starts having you start questioning, and you're like, oh, those first two are actually wrong. But again, it's gonna feel uncomfortable. You're gonna like, well, the first two are obvious. You click it. Oh, well, yeah, that's kind of wrong. Just go, automatically, go to the second page.
Okay, thank you. Next question. How do we get or help stakeholders and decision makers, particularly those who aren't technical, to take bias into account when they use data to make decisions? So that's one of my questions.
Okay, so I will tell you there's a lot of movement in this space. There's movement with respect to federal government, there's movement with respect to state agencies, there's movement with respect to social advocacy groups like ACLU in order to ensure that when any system is deployed, now not chatbots for shopping, but systems that are deployed that could impact our civil liberties, healthcare, education, policing, surveillance, that a requirement for deployment and purchase is to have citizens, to have advocacy groups actually part of the process of engaging and purchasing. So that is a movement that's going on, which is pretty nice. And so one of the things I would say is we as computer scientists, one, have to figure out how to communicate to non-computer scientists, to actually explain what's going on and not just assume because they're not computer scientists that they're not going to get it. I think that's one of our responsibilities, because one of the fears that I have, which I've seen, is that you have the purchasers, which usually aren't computer scientists, you have the advocacy groups, which sometimes, but most likely, are not necessarily computer scientists, and they're having a conversation. And there's never anyone in the room that actually knows what's going on. And when we come into the room, we sometimes talk at such a level that they're like, we're just going to talk with each other. And so I think one of the things we need to do is learn how to talk to non-technical people about what is it that we do and why some things are biased and what we can do to make it unbiased and kind of the solutions. I think that's our role.
Thank you. Another question. Could an AI dynamically learn to deceive based on users' comfort? For example, a care robot learns to deceive a patient with dementia to make them comfortable.
Yes. There is some research that shows this can be done for, and just so you know, at least in research, there's these elements of risk. And so the research that has been around cognitive impairments has been mild cognitive impairments versus higher dementia where you really don't have as much autonomy. And so there's this element of autonomy. And so some of the work around this dementia is around medication adherence, because that is, I mean, just for most people, I mean, how many times are you supposed to take your medicine from the doctor and you're like, oh, I forgot the last dose. Well, it's okay, right? Like, this is a historic issue for every age. And so they've had some research that shows when you have an agent kind of nudge a little bit, you can have patients remember better about medication adherence.
Okay, thank you. Have there been studies looking at bias when using different ethnic voices? Using different ethnic voices.
So the closest is using different intonations that show nationality. Not necessarily, which in some cases links to ethnicity, but not always. So they've shown, depending on the application, I will tell you, this is a bias, English, American English actually has a higher compliance, but I think it's because if you think about tech companies, you think about most of the technology that's out there is already biased. And so what I believe is that what we're looking at is this element, just like with the voice. We're used to this, and so anything that is different, it causes a discomfort, and therefore we quickly go back to the, oh, my favorite, my preferred is the American English. But there has been some, at least in terms of accents.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question because of time, but we have several coming in, so thank you all. And I'm sure she will be available for a while to answer additional questions that we don't get to today here. But another question is, how do you think the patterns of trust might translate to synthetic humans and AI avatars in virtual reality? Is the robot metal body the trigger for these assumptions?
So there is an element of realism that once we get over, and you can call it the uncanny valley. So if anyone knows uncanny valley, it's this element that when we know it's a machine, we know it's an AI agent, we interacted, we're very comfortable. But once it gets to the element of being too human, our ability to relate is actually negated. So think about Night of the Living Dead. If a corpse suddenly comes up and starts walking, it looks like a human, it doesn't quite look like that, freaks us out. So the same with robotics. So with synthetic humans, if it gets to be to the point of being too real, we will actually start disconnecting, distrusting it more. And so people are still trying to figure out where that comfort level is. And I will tell you, it's shifted, right? It has shifted over the years of us being more and more comfortable with different features, different interactions, different movements. So at some point, we will be fully comfortable with a truly synthetic human that sort of almost looks human. We'll be like, yeah, we know it's a machine because we've been accustomed to seeing it.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's give her another round of applause.